Hi, my name is Sana Smith, and I'm the creator of Forum for Music, a series that explores different themes. This concert is a concert about Reformation hymns, an exploration of the songs that changed the world. I hope you enjoy it. It may seem obvious to open a concert about Reformation hymns with Ein feste Burg. Its composer, Martin Luther, is the name associated with the Reformation. But why Luther? What would embolden this lifelong adherent to the church to challenge tradition, culture, practice? And why did people respond? To examine these questions, we will use their hymns as our lesson book, as they were pivotal to Luther's campaign. The German Jesuit said that Luther had, quote, destroyed more souls with his hymns than with all his writing and preaching, close quote. Many movements have used music to galvanize its followers, but the Reformation was extraordinary in that it delivered its new message through its hymns. Luther's audience was not one that questioned the existence of God or that human beings are subject to him. Rather, the task of the reformers was to clarify the terms of this relationship. They were teaching a dependency on Christ alone. In verse 2, did we in our own strength confide, our striving would be losing. They were teaching a dependency on faith alone. In verse 3, we will not fear, for God hath willed. If you look at the original German, it's more subtle. Fürchten wir uns nicht so sehr. There's an admission of fear, yes, but faith reins it in. There's a limit. They were teaching a dependency on the Bible alone. In verse 4, that word above all earthly powers. To the average person in Luther's world who had little agency in life, how radical would the idea be that though they take from us this life, goods, name, child, and wife, even then nothing was lost. The kingdom shall stay with us, it says in verse 4. And Luther stamps this with an emphatic doch. Early printings of this hymn reveal a melody that's more syncopated. It was identified as a hymn of comfort. So, despite the imagery, this is not a march to battle. This is encouragement dressed in the warmth of song. We will return now to that syncopated version, verses 2, 3, and 4.
Friede ist diese Welt, wir sagen
The catalyst for Luther's departure from the church's teaching was the Apostle Paul's letter to the new Christians in Rome. Quote, "For we hold that a person is justified by faith apart from works prescribed by the law." Close quote. This can be found in Romans chapter 3, verse 28. The belief in a God who judges all humans was virtually universal in Luther's time. The thunderbolt in Paul's statement was that this judgment was based on fundamentally different terms from what was being taught by the church. The first point of Luther's 95 Theses talks about whole life repentance, a change of direction, versus penance, which fed the economy of indulgences. Luther's personal conversion experience is made public in Nun freut euch, lieben Christen, gemein, which is not really a hymn so much as is a Zeitungslied, a newspaper song. Andreas Löwer writes of this genre, quote, "In an age of significant illiteracy, singing the Reformation message to popular tunes was a powerful and effective means of disseminating views." Close quote. Luther describes his situation. In verse 2, "Fast bound in Satan's chains I lay." And in verse 3, "My own good works availed not." He uses words like fears, despair, suffering. This is the existential crisis of a man who felt his own deficiency. For any who could relate to the sense of being overwhelmed, of being fearful or helpless, Luther offered not a platitude, but a kind deliverer. In verse 4, "A father's heart he turned to me. He sought my redemption fervently." Just a note, in addition to scrapping the traditional Latin in services, Luther stressed the participation of the congregation, and hymn singing was an integral aspect of this participation. So, lieben Christen, gemein, dear Christians one and all, is not only an address, it's a vision. No longer the domain of the clergy, participation in church, participation in one's own eternal destiny, was put in the hands of the common person and celebrated with singing.
Nun freut euch, liebe Christen, gemein, und lasst uns fröhlich springen. Das wird getrost und allein, mit Lust und Liebe singen. Was Gott an uns gewendet hat, und seines Wesen wundert hat. Gott hat es erworben. Danket Gott in Ewigkeit, mein Willen lassen. Gedacht an sein Barmherzigkeit, wollt Hilfen lassen. War so mir das Gottes Herz, es war mein gewahr Scherz, ist sein bestes Kosten.
In his book, Protestants, The Faith That Made the Modern World, Alec Ryrie points to free inquiry, democracy, and the limitation of government as lasting legacies of the Reformation. Ryrie defines free inquiry as this refusal to allow anyone else to rule your thinking. Democracy as the responsibility an individual has to reject systems that they think are wrong. And the limitation of government refers to the curtailing of a government's authority to just practical matters. In an interview about the book, Ryrie says it's these qualities that are at the heart of liberal market democracies. Quote, "Though it seems obvious to us that liberty and equality should go together, It is not at all an obvious combination. It is that distinct heritage of Protestantism in holding those models together that is its most significant contribution to the modern world. Close quote. But how does the individual, especially when stripped of the safeguards of establishment and tradition, face not only opposing institutions, but everyday life? In Befiehl, deine, Wege, Paul Gerhardt writes a verse to each word of Luther's translation of Psalm 37:5. Commit your way to the Lord, trust in him. Gerhardt does not simply write a mnemonic to help you memorize the verse. Rather, he gives instructions on how one entrusts their way. How do you do it? By looking at proof. In verse 1, you must look to God's work, visible in clouds, air, and wind. Gerhardt's God is not the creationist's passive watchmaker. He is, verse 2, a father who undertakes. In verse 3 in the German, it talks about das treibst du. Treiben is the verbiest of verbs. It undergirds activity. We will hear the Hans Leo Hassler version of the melody as used by Bach in St. Matthew Passion. In that poignant context, verse 1 of this hymn is sung as Jesus responds to Pilate's accusations with silence. Again, how does one commit their way? One commits because Jesus did first.
Befiehl du seine Wege und lass deine Herzen kränkt, ihr allertreuesten Pflege ist mir niemand. Wir wollen Luft und Wind, wie Hügel auf und ab. Wir auf Wege finden und Fuß gehen kann. Ein Liebe, Treu und Gnaden, o Vater, weiß und sieht, was gut sei unterstanden, im sterblichen Gemüt, und was gut alle lesen, was bleibt zu sterben hält, und bringt zum Stand und Wesen, was deinem Rat gefällt. Uphold, du arme Seele, auf uns Heil und Friedensmacht. Gott wird dich aus der Hölle, da dich der Tod macht. In großer Gnade erwarte nur der Zeit, so wirst du schon sie ist von der schönsten Freud.
The Reformation played a hand in the history of Europe in other ways too. The 30 Years' War of 1618 to 1648 was ostensibly a war of religion, as the deal struck at Augsburg in 1555, which allowed local princes to choose the religion of their region, was threatened by Emperor Ferdinand II's rise to power. This war was known as one of history's most devastating, some areas losing up to 60% of their population. The effects of the physical conflict paled in comparison to the devastating disease and famine it induced. Ringkart provided pastoral care for his town in this time, including burial services, as many as 50 per day, and he fed the hungry hordes with the sustenance that threatened his own family's existence. Still, he wrote these astonishing words, thanking God with all his being, with heart, mouth, and hands. It's striking that Ringkart employs language of thanks for the present. He was not bearing his circumstances because he believed in a reward beyond. Somehow, Ringkart still saw the brightness of God's goodness despite the darkness of his time. This kind of genuineness and generosity was the antidote to the hypocrisy and avarice that Luther and others were calling out as needing reform in the church. We will hear this hymn now with the third verse of our performance using the setting from Bach's Cantata 192. In that case, the hymn melody and text are supported with ever rising lines in the vocal part, especially in the bass. And this gives the effect that the tune and the text are being lifted higher and higher heavenward.
Nun danket alle Gott mit Herzen, Mund und Händen, der große Dinge tut, an uns und allen Enden, der uns von Mutter Leib und Kindesbeinen an und selig viel zu gut, bis hat getan. Der ewig reiche Gott wohl uns bei unserem Leben ein immer Fröhlichkeit und hegen Frieden geben und uns in seiner Gnade erhalten fort und fort und uns aus aller Not erlösen hier und dort. Der